Welcome to our first video on financial calculators. In this video, I want to just cover some of the very basic things. And if you've played around with your financial calculator much at all, you'll notice a couple of sets of keys. One of the sets of keys looks like this. There's an N, an I/Y, PV, PMT, and FV. And then there's a second set of keys that looks like this: CF, NPV, and IRR. So today I'm only going to focus on these. I'll save the others for a later time. And so quickly, some introductory notes. The first thing, and really the most important thing that I want you to recognize, is that no matter what you do with a financial calculator, writing down a timeline and understanding the formulas that are taking place beneath the surface, that's what's essential. The timelines that you write and the formulas that you use capture all the intuition that you need to do finance. Your calculator does not. Your calculator is just a tool that's going to do exactly what you tell it to. And so if you know what you're telling it to do, you're going to get a good output. And if you give it garbage, you're going to get garbage out. Now, for exam purposes, note that I still may ask questions that are specifically about the formulas or require you to only use the formulas. And so that'll kind of keep everyone honest. So for example, instead of asking you for a numerical answer to a problem, I could ask you something like, which of the following formulas, when solved, will give you the answer? And so at the end of the day, I want you to view your calculator as a practical tool that is certainly useful and should be used, but only after you've mastered the intuition behind the valuation concepts of the problems. Now, there are many models of calculators, and they all do basically the same thing. Two of the most popular are the Texas Instruments BA2 Plus. There's also a BA2 Plus Professional. Those are basically the same thing. And then there's the Hewlett-Packard 10B. These two models will be somewhere around $40. You can find them just about anywhere that sells calculators, and so you should be completely fine with those. The one that I use the most is this TI BA2 Plus, and so I'm a little bit better versed in that one, and so I can provide you the best support on that model. But either one of these is fine. I know that also many folks have a TI graphing calculator, like a TI 84, I believe. Most of these graphing calculators do have financial functions in them as well, and those are totally fine. But instead of having buttons you push for the N and the PV and the PMT, they're going to have menus, and so you'll have to enter values. But those are fine if you have one of those from a math course and you want to use that. And as you move into industry, Excel is kind of the tool of choice. It's oftentimes more efficient to set things up in a spreadsheet. And so if you look at the formulas inside Excel, you'll see things like PV and FV and PMT and all of that. And so everything that you can do in a financial calculator, you can do in Microsoft Excel. All right, so here are the 5 keys that we deal with in the basic functionality of the financial calculator. I want to give you some very precise definitions for these keys. So let's start with PV. So instead of calling PV a present value in the financial calculator, I want you to think literally a times zero cash flow. Okay, that's pretty much the same thing as a present value, but it's subtly different. So you'll see that in a minute once we get to a timeline. N is the number of periods on the timeline that you're dealing with. FV, similar to the PV, don't think of this as literally a future value. Rather, think of it as some time in cash flow. So again, kind of like a future value, but not exactly the same thing. The PMT, or the payment key, is an annuity payment. And the I, or the I/Y, is a periodic interest rate. Now, be very careful on how you enter I. If you have, say, 1%, most calculators are going to ask you to enter that as 1 instead of 0.01. Now, of course, if you enter 0.01, your calculator will compute something, but it will compute the answer with a 0.01% interest rate, which is probably not what you're looking for. And so you can see from the setup here that we are dealing with an annuity type problem. So this functionality that we're dealing with here is going to solve annuity type problems. And that's also going to include problems with a single cash flow at some moment in time. If you've got a problem where you've got 6 periods and 6 different cash flows, this is not going to work. We'll have to use a different procedure that we'll cover in another video. All right, so the functionality here then is it's pretty simple. Again, you've got 5 variables. You're going to input 4 of these, and the calculator is going to compute the 5th. And this computation is probably going to require you to push some other key, like a compute key, or in the case of the BA2+, the CPT key. Okay, so what does the calculator actually do? Well, it solves an equation. Here's the equation, and this should look vaguely familiar, at least certain parts of it do. So let's start with here in the middle. You'll see that we have the present value of an annuity here. Then on the right side, we've got the present value of a single future cash flow. And here back on the left, we've got a single times 0 cash flow. And so as you see from this equation, the calculator takes all of these inputs that it's given and sets the total present value of all 3 boxes to 0. Put another way, we can draw a timeline. So let's draw a timeline with n periods. Your calculator is going to see this. Okay. So you've got a times 0 cash flow here. That's PV. You've got a series of payments from time 1 through time n. There's your annuity. And then you finally got a single cash flow at time n. That is FV. Now, be very careful here with these final 2 cash flows. Note that the FV then is whatever happens at time n that is incremental to what's already covered by the annuity payment. Now we can see that we have 3 types of cash flows here. We have a time 0 cash flow going into PV, a time n cash flow going into FV, and finally an annuity cash flow going into PMT. Now, because your calculator sets the right-hand side of this equation equal to 0, mathematically, we need amongst these cash flows a negative and a positive. If that doesn't happen, there's no way to establish the equality, and your calculator will generate an error. I think a simple way to think about this is to divide your cash flows into inflows and outflows. Okay, and all this is going to be determined in the context of the problem that you're working. So, for example, think about investing money in an account as an outflow because the money is going out of your pocket, and then think of receiving money from the account as an inflow because the money is coming into your pocket. Anything that represents an inflow needs one sign, and anything that represents an outflow needs the opposite sign. So here the inflows would be positive, the outflows would be negative. Another example would be a car loan. So when you initially obtain the loan, the bank gives you money to buy the car, and so that's an inflow from the bank to you. And then throughout the life of the loan, you're making monthly payments to the bank, and so those payments are going to be outflows from you to the bank. A third example would be a company who is undertaking an investment project. And so at the beginning of the project, perhaps the company must buy a piece of machinery, so that's an outflow. And then throughout the life of the project, the machinery will generate cash inflows for the company. So the annuity payments and then maybe any time in cash flow through the FV represent inflows. And so the purchase of the machine would take on a negative sign, and the cash flows coming in would take on positive signs. All right, so let's work through a few examples. So here's a super simple one. It's about a single cash flow. So you'll receive $1,000 in 1 year. How much is this worth today if the appropriate discount rate is 10%? So starting with the timeline, we see that we only have one period, and we have $1,000 in year one, and we want to find what this is worth today. All right, now on our financial calculator, we have a PV, an FV, PMT, I, and N. So what goes where? Well, first of all, let's start with the timeline itself. So we've got one period on the timeline, and so N is going to be 1. The discount rate is 10%, so I is going to be 10. Now remember, you enter 10% as 10, not 0.1. What about the payment? Well, there is no annuity in this problem, and so you're going to set payment equal to 0. Where does the 1,000 go? Well, that's a time 1 cash flow or a time in cash flow, so that's the FV. What about PV? That's the 5th key. That's what we're finding. Now, what is the sign of PV going to be? The answer is, if we enter FV as positive, PV is going to come out as negative. Now, thinking about inflows and outflows in this particular problem, think about this $1,000 as money that's going to come into you 1 year from now. The only way for you to be entitled to receive $1,000 in a year is for you to pay something today. And so think of the PV as the investment into whatever this vehicle is. Now here's an electronic version of the BA2 Plus calculator, and so we'll just use that to solve this problem. Now, it's good practice before you do any calculations with your financial calculator to clear the time value of money, because this calculator does have a memory, and even after you turn it off, it can remember things that are stored inside it. So by force of habit, I always clear my time value of money before working a new problem. And that's in this clear TVM, which is the second key for the FV. And so you just hit second FV to clear it. All right, so now I'm just going to go and insert these values one at a time and then solve for PV. And so the way it works with this calculator is you type the value and then you tell it where to put it. And so I'll say $1,000 FV. And when I get a screen like this where it shows the little caret and it shows this equality sign, that tells me that the value has been entered. So I've entered $1,000 in FV. I need to enter 0 in payment, 10 in I, 1 in N, and then I just need to solve for PV. Now I don't just press PV, I say compute PV. So here's the compute key up in the top left. So compute PV, and I get minus 909. And so it's negative as we expected it to be, okay? And it's a number that is lower in value than the $1,000, and so discounting this does work right. And so if you want to check this out, take 909 and 9 cents and multiply it by 1.1, and you'll get to $1,000. The second example is a loan. So here you're going to borrow $100,000 for a house. Your interest rate is going to be 12% per year, and the term of your loan is 30 years. So we'll keep annual payments here for simplicity, but know that in reality, a mortgage is typically done with monthly payments. And so the timeline itself needs to have 30 ticks. And so what's it going to look like? Well, on the front end, you're going to receive $100,000 from the bank, and you're going to use that to purchase your house. And then each year thereafter, you're going to make a payment to the bank until the debt is settled, and that happens after year 30. Okay, so again, going to your calculator, we've got PV, FV, PMT, I, and N. So what goes where? All right, let's start by thinking about inflows and outflows. I'm going to think of this $100,000 as an inflow because it's money that you receive from the bank to use on the purchase of your house. And since you've got to pay the bank back, I'm going to think of the payments as outflows. And so the $100,000 is going to have a positive sign. The payments are going to end up having a negative sign. All right, what else do we know? Well, we know that this timeline has 30 payments, so that's going to be N. We know that there is an interest rate of 12% per year, so that's going to be I. So I'll go ahead and put my 30 here and my 12 here. This number here, since it occurs at time 0, is going to be PV. What about FV? Well, this payment happens at time 30, but that's going to be covered through the payment key. What's the FV? There is no incremental cash flow at time 30, so FV has got to be 0. So we'll put 0 here and solve for payment. I'll grab my calculator once again. And so the last problem is still in memory, so I'm going to start by clearing that. So second, clear time value of money. So it's all clear. I'll go ahead and clear that too, just for convenience on my part. Now let's go just through this list and enter everything. So 100,000 with a positive sign goes into PV. 0 goes into FV. 12 goes into I. 30 goes into N. Now I'm ready to find payment. So compute PMT, and there's my answer. $12,414.37. One more example. How long will it take to accumulate $10,000 in an account earning 10% per year if you start with $1,000 in the account and make additional yearly payments of $500? So this one's a little bit more complex. Now, this timeline's a little bit different because we don't know how long it is, because that's what we're solving for. Okay, but we do know that there's going to be an initial deposit of $1,000 and additional yearly deposits of $500. And then we're going to need $10,000 in the end. We have these boxes to fill. And so what goes where? Starting with inflows and outflows again. Since we're depositing money into an account, I want to think of that as going out of my pocket into the account. So I'm going to think of the deposits as an outflow. And so I'm going to make this negative as well as all of these. And then at the end of this timeline, at the end of end periods, I'm going to pretend that I withdraw the $10,000 and bring it into a wallet. So that's going to be positive. Okay. Now, the $1,000 happens at time 0, so that's PV. The $500 payments represent an annuity, so those are going to be PMT. $10,000 happens at time N, so that's going to be FV. And we're given in the problem 10, and so that's going to be I. Remembering our signs, we need negative 1,000 for PV, positive 10,000 for FV, negative 500 is the payment, 10 as I, and N is what we're finding. To the financial calculator, start by clearing everything. And now we go. $1,000, change the sign to negative, goes into PV. $10,000 as a positive number goes into FV. 500, change the sign to negative, goes into PMT. 10 goes into I. Now I have 4 things entered, and I'm going to compute the 5th. So let's compute N. And we have an N of 9.6 years. So it'll take almost 10 years to get to $10,000.